Everyone knows the rat, the villain of the medieval world, the creature that supposedly brought Europe to its knees and killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire human population in just a few years. They show up in every plague painting, every history book, every Halloween decoration. They are, for better or worse, the mascot of the worst biological disaster in human history. But here's what nobody ever asks. What was it actually like to be one of them? Before we get into it, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment telling us which animal you'd like us to cover next. Because after today, you'll never look at rats the same way again. The world they lived in. To understand what life was like for a rat during the Black Plague, you first have to understand the world they were operating in. And honestly, for a rat, 14th century Europe was paradise, at least at first. Medieval cities were, by modern standards, absolutely filthy. There was no sewage system worth mentioning. Garbage was thrown directly into the streets. Livestock wandered through market squares. Food scraps piled up in alleys, and grain, enormous quantities of it, was stored in warehouses, cellars, and barns with almost no pest control whatsoever. If you were designing a utopia for a small, opportunistic omnivore with a talent for squeezing through tight spaces, you would basically just draw a map of 14th century Paris or London and call it a day. The rat that spread the plague was most likely the black rat, Rattus rattus, also called the ship rat or roof rat. Smaller and more agile than the brown rats you might see today, black rats were expert climbers. They nested in the upper floors of buildings, in thatched roofs, in the wooden beams of merchant ships. They were social animals, living in tight colonies, grooming each other, competing for hierarchy, raising their young in the dark warmth of walls and ceilings that medieval humans never thought to check. Life, for a rat in 1340, was genuinely good. Abundant food, warm shelter, few predators willing to venture into the dense warrens of a human city. And then, the ships arrived. Somewhere around 1346, likely in the ports of Central Asia or along the Silk Road trade routes, a flea bit a rat. Specifically, the oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chiapis, ingested blood infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. Here is where things get genuinely strange, because the plague's relationship with rats is far more complicated than the history books let on. The flea didn't just carry the bacteria. Inside the flea's gut, Yersinia pestis would multiply until it formed a blockage. When the flea tried to feed again, it couldn't swallow, so it regurgitated bacteria-laden blood directly back into the bite wound of its host. The rat was infected, the colony was infected, and the rat had absolutely no idea. Symptoms in rats progressed quickly. Swollen lymph nodes, buboes, appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck. Hemorrhaging under the skin caused dark blotches. Fever set in, and within days, the rat was dead. Now here is the part that sealed humanity's fate. When the rat died, the fleas living on it needed a new host, and they weren't picky. They found the nearest warm body available, another rat, a dog, a cat, or a human sleeping just a few feet away on the other side of a wooden floor. The rats didn't spread the plague because they were malicious. They spread it because they died. Before the plague reached them, the average rat's day was a masterclass in opportunistic survival. Black rats are primarily nocturnal. They spent daylight hours tucked into their nests, tight, warm bundles of shredded cloth, straw, and whatever soft materials they could steal from human homes. The colony slept together, piled up for warmth, the dominant males taking the most protected spots in the center. At dusk, the foraging began. A rat needs to eat roughly 10% of its body weight every single day, which meant constant scavenging. Medieval grain stores were the jackpot. A well-stocked warehouse could sustain an entire colony through winter. But rats weren't fussy. They ate bread, cheese, meat scraps, fish bones, candle wax, leather, and occasionally each other if things got desperate. They contaminated far more than they consumed, urinating and defecating across food stores in ways that caused their own separate wave of sickness in human populations, entirely unrelated to plague. Water was sourced from puddles, troughs, and the open channels of human waste that ran through city streets. Charming. Social hierarchy was strict. Dominant males had priority access to food and mates. Weaker males were forced to forage in more dangerous territory, closer to human activity, more exposed to predators, more likely to end up in a trap or under a boot. Female rats could produce litters of up to 12 pups every 3 to 4 weeks under good conditions, which meant a single colony could explode in population across a single season. By the time the plague arrived in European ports in 1347, urban rat populations in cities like Genoa, Venice, and Marseille were enormous. Let's talk about the fleas, because the rat didn't really have a choice in any of this, and that's worth understanding. Every rat in a medieval city carried fleas. This wasn't a sign of poor hygiene by rat standards, it was simply unavoidable. Fleas were everywhere, in bedding, in floor rushes, on dogs, on cats, on humans. For the rat, fleas were a persistent irritation, a constant background noise of itching and grooming. Rats spent significant time grooming themselves and each other, which is partly social bonding and partly a sincere effort to manage their flea load. It didn't work very well. When Yersinia pestis entered a rat colony via infected fleas, the rats had no immunity whatsoever. This was a bacterium their immune systems had never encountered. They died in enormous numbers. Historians and archaeologists have found evidence of mass rat die-offs preceding human plague outbreaks by days or weeks. Medieval humans actually noticed this. Chronicles from the period describe rats staggering out of walls and dying in the open streets before the human deaths began. They just didn't understand what it meant. Some rats, a small number, did survive infection. Genetic research has shown that certain rat populations carried variants that offered partial resistance to Yersinia pestis. These were the animals whose descendants would eventually repopulate European cities once the plague moved on. But in the first terrible years of the Black Death, from 1347 to 1351, rat mortality was catastrophic alongside human mortality. The difference was that rats reproduced fast enough to replace their losses. Humans did not. One thing that genuinely worked in the rats' favor, plague aside, was the architecture. Medieval cities were essentially custom-built rat infrastructure. Timber-framed buildings with gaps in the walls, thatched roofs full of insulating nesting material, cellars connected to street-level drains, market districts with permanent food residue baked into the cobblestones. Black rats, being roof rats, preferred the upper floors. They ran along ceiling beams, slipped between wall cavities, traveled across rooftops from building to building without ever touching the street. This is actually significant for plague transmission. It put them in close proximity to sleeping humans, who in medieval times often shared upper floors with stored food and, consequently, with rats. The flea jumping from a dying rat to a sleeping peasant was not a long journey. Ports were the highways of rat civilization. Ships were essentially mobile rat colonies, warm, full of stored grain and provisions, with ropes and anchor chains that functioned as perfectly engineered boarding ramps. The black rat's talent for climbing made ships their natural habitat, and it was ships that carried infected rat populations from port to port across the Mediterranean, and then up through Atlantic Europe, at speeds that mirrored the documented spread of the plague itself. Almost exactly. Follow the trade routes, and you follow the rats. Life wasn't entirely comfortable even before the plague arrived. Urban rats faced a range of threats that shaped their behavior in ways that are still visible in rat populations today. Cats were the primary predator, and medieval Europeans kept them for exactly this reason. However, and this is where history takes a dark turn for both species, the Catholic Church had, in the preceding century, associated black cats in particular with witchcraft and heresy. Widespread cat culls in parts of Europe had significantly reduced feral cat populations in some cities, which rat populations had responded to by expanding. Some historians argue this cat persecution meaningfully worsened the plague's impact, though the degree to which this contributed is still debated. What is not debated is that fewer cats meant more rats, and more rats meant more flea-carrying hosts. Other predators included dogs, owls, weasels, and the occasional desperate human. Rat catching was a legitimate profession in medieval cities, with rat catchers using trained ferrets, traps, and poisons derived from arsenic and plant compounds. These efforts were, by all evidence, wildly insufficient. The rat's best defense was always speed, small size, and an extraordinarily good sense of smell. Rats have poor eyesight, but can detect predators, food, and the pheromones of other rats at remarkable distances. When a rat sensed danger, a predator scent, a trap, even the death pheromones released by a dying colony member, it could communicate alarm through ultrasonic vocalizations, inaudible to humans. The colony would scatter and regroup elsewhere. This behavioral flexibility is a large part of why, despite everything, rats survived the plague. They are, fundamentally, very hard to kill entirely. Here is the strange part of the rats' plague experience. As human civilization around them began to collapse, as entire villages emptied, as cities lost a third of their population in months, as farms were abandoned and trade slowed, the rats' world changed in ways that were both good and terrible. On one hand, abandoned buildings meant undisturbed nesting grounds. Food stores left behind by fleeing or dying humans were an unexpected windfall. Rats moved into emptied homes, granaries, churches. Population in some areas may have temporarily boomed on the abundance left behind by mass human death. On the other hand, the plague was killing rats too. Remember, and the social disruption inside rat colonies mirrored in miniature what was happening in human ones. Dominant animals died, hierarchies collapsed, colonies that had occupied the same territory for generations fragmented, and desperate individuals moved into new areas, spreading infected fleas further in the process. The rats were not orchestrating any of this. They were caught in the same catastrophe as everyone else, just running faster and breeding faster, and dying in the walls where nobody could see them. This is the part that's genuinely worth sitting with. The rat had no understanding of what was happening. It had no concept of the bacterium living in its bloodstream, no awareness of the flea on its back, no knowledge that its death would send that flea onto the child sleeping 3 feet below. It was just an animal doing what animals do: eating, nesting, grooming, reproducing, dying. The Black Death killed an estimated 25 million people in Europe in 5 years. It reshaped the continent's economy, its religion, its art, its social structure in ways that are still visible today. And at the center of it was this small, clever, adaptable creature that just wanted access to a grain store and a warm place to sleep. We spent centuries blaming the rat, building stories around it as a symbol of filth and death and moral corruption. And look, the rat's role in the plague's transmission is real. The flea-rat-flea-human chain is well documented. But recent research has actually complicated even this. Some scientists now argue that human body lice and fleas may have been more significant vectors than rat fleas in many outbreaks, and that the speed of plague spread in some regions is hard to explain by rat movement alone. The rat may be, at least partially, history's most successful scapegoat. What we know for certain is this: the Black Death was not a punishment. It was not a conspiracy. It was a pathogen, a flea, a rat, and a world with no defenses against any of them. The rat didn't start the plague. It just had the bad luck of being the perfect host. For the flea, that did. And somewhere in the walls of a medieval city, a small black rat with a swollen lymph node stumbled out into the daylight, lay down on the cobblestones, and died, having never understood a single thing about its place in the worst catastrophe in human history. So what do you think? Does the rat deserve its reputation? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to keep going down this particular rabbit hole, check out our video on the animals that shaped human history. You might be surprised, who else is on that list?